ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the F4L Headquarters Podcast. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I know, you guys are like, wait a minute, didn't we just hear you talk 7 hours ago or eight hours ago? And the answer would be correct. Yeah, I did do a regular show for you guys earlier today where I gave my traditional shout-outs and words of wisdom about various subjects. But today, right now, this is a special show. I had hoped that we were going to have a guest to join me. Unfortunately, unable to attend right now. As, you know, things come up, life comes up, so no big deal. So we're about to celebrate this, and it's going to be epic as we're about to embark upon our Halloween spectacular, or our Halloween special, here at the F4L Headquarters Podcast. Consider it I guess you might say, consider it a random type of thing. Consider this to be this is going to be very much a special show. It's going to be epic, and we look very forward to this show. I am just responding to people who have done some big things as I last thing I'm going to do as I congratulate people. All right, there, I responded. Sorry, folks. The life of being me is that you get... Sometimes I get no responses for quite a while, and then all of a sudden everyone hits me up all at once. Does anybody else have this issue? Well, I have it all the time. All right, we had some changes done to the setup and multiple other things. I've got some new music, for example, that we're going to be using for this going forward. And all kinds of other things. So this is our Halloween special, and this is going to be a little bit of a random kind of a show. For one thing, I'm going to be doing something kind of different that I hope you guys enjoy. I'm going to be reading one of the classic poems by someone who is dubbed the grandfather or the father of modern horror. And that, of course, being Boston's own Edgar Allan Poe. And tonight we're going to read one of probably his most famous poems that anyone who has ever studied literature, classic literature I should say, or has ever watched The Simpsons Halloween special is probably familiar with the poem The Raven that we will read a little bit later on. But first and foremost, let's have a chat about, Halloween in general. And what does it mean for different people? And I think ultimately, in reality speaking, really Halloween fits many genres, and it fits all over the place, right? I think that no matter where you are in the world, people look at Halloween in different ways. I think in the West being America, a lot of people will look at Halloween as a day to simply decorate our homes, dress up in costumes, and buy and give out candy and so forth, and hijinks can ensue. However, a lot of people might be shocked to find out the origins of Halloween, and there are some cultures in the world that Halloween is very sacred even to this day. It is a serious holiday, and it is a holiday that, a lot of people, especially in the Celtic traditions, do follow a lot of the Halloween traditions because I mean, if we're going to talk about how Halloween began, you really got to look at the old Celtic rituals and so forth. The idea was, the people of the town were afraid that demons and the devil would come and take people's souls. So what they would do is they would dress up in various different mystiques and different costumes and so forth to disguise themselves when the demons would come, to act as a confusion. And then what they would do is offer other things in return for themselves, like candy or trinkets or food, to appease the demons that would come. So one, they wear costumes to hide themselves from the evil that would supposedly take them, and the other half was to offer them something to leave them alone, like food or trinkets. And this is ultimately where the idea and the concept of Halloween would originally become synonymous with the world. And of course, everyone has different ways of celebrating it, and there are some people who don't celebrate it at all. And you know what? Being F4L, we respect everyone's cultures and everyone's backgrounds and beliefs and so forth. And I am someone who I'll be the first to admit, I have to see it to believe it. I don't want to sound like one of those people, but I am. I need to see whatever it is that, we're talking about. But before we go any further, I don't think there is anyone better to introduce this first segment. We're going to talk about the folklore and the various different ways different places celebrate Halloween, and perhaps different areas that wish that Halloween wasn't a thing at all. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Ant Band. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about the history a little bit of Halloween and how different cultures and different places in the world look at it. And as I mentioned before I interrupted myself, before I introduced my Ant Band, I was telling you guys a little bit about the early folklore, how it really was a Celtic tradition, the Celtic being the Irish, the Scottish, and so forth, who are, growing up in an Irish household. I can tell you that stories and wisdom are things that go along with the Irish culture. I haven't really talked a lot about my culture or the Irish part of me. I'm very proud of my Irish heritage. And what I never really get to do is celebrate my grandmother. I'm talking about my mother's mother. She and her family came from Ireland, and we still have family to this day in Ireland. And Ireland is a very large country, believe it or not, for being an island. We have family in Galway, Cork, Dublin, and a couple other places throughout. I said Galway. Yeah, there was multiple areas. So Galway, Dublin, Cork are places in which, Dublin, Cork, Galway are three of the most notorious places you'll find a Stephen somewhere. And I haven't really talked a lot about a lot of that stuff because, again, my blood family are not people I really associate much with. But one of the things I don't often give credit to, or one of the people I don't talk a lot about, other than when I talk about who I credit for my martial art training, is my grandmother. Let me tell you a little bit about my grandmother before, so you can have a better understanding. My grandmother literally came off the boat with a lot of the other Irish immigrants who came over during or after the potato famine that almost wiped out almost the entire country. The story of when the our family came to America was a very interesting one, very tragic, but also heroic, and spoke of a new beginning and new hope. My grandmother was someone who, prior to her coming down with dementia and Alzheimer's, was a very wise woman, very smart, had a really good wit about her, as we call it, say in our thing. She's actually the one who taught me kind of how to talk, because I spent a lot of time around her, almost more so than my mother. You have to remember that when I was born, my mother was very young. She was at school for most of the time when I was very young, and then she was, finishing school and working on college even after that. So clearly I needed someone to watch me. So when I was a very young, a baby, pretty much, my grandmother and aunts and so forth, my grandmother and my aunt, which was my mother's biggest fan, they would take care of me the most at that time. And then as I got older, another aunt would come, and I would spend a lot of time with them as well. But my grandmother is someone who really should be talked about more, especially since, technically speaking, my grandmother used to tell the story how her birthday was just straight before midnight on Halloween. So technically today is her birthday, my grandmother. Because she was born on October 30th, way back when. And the story goes is if she had waited one more minute, she would have been born at midnight on Halloween. But she came out just straight before midnight, as she says. So she was born on October 30th with like seconds to spare. So she was not born on Halloween. But one of the things that is also interesting was that my grandmother was someone who not only did she tell a lot of stories as far as growing up in Ireland. I think everybody in my family theoretically has told me a story here and there who has been over there. To be fair, my mother has never been to Ireland, to my knowledge. Unfortunately, I can't confirm or deny that, except for my aunt, the oldest of my aunts and uncles and of my mother's siblings. She could probably confirm or deny that my mother was there. I will have to follow up with you guys on that. But I am going to go on the limb that my mother has never been to Ireland, because that would also mean her twin brother Paul would also have had to go on, and I've never heard either one of them tell those stories. However, it's interesting how everyone else does. My grandmother, who talked a lot about our culture and our heritage, because she thought that was important to learn how we came into the country and how we were treated when we came to the country, and also why we came into the country to begin with. So, one of the interesting things about when my grandmother would tell stories is she would become very animated when she would tell these stories. Very, not animated, but very precise and stoic when she told stories. Now, my Aunt Eleanor, I told my aunt's name, she was the one who was my mother's biggest fan. She was someone who was very animated, and she was also the only person in our family to actually write like myself. So much so that she was actually working on a novel to get it published. She loved writing poems and stories and songs and what have you. She loved romance novels, did Aunt Eleanor, and she sometimes lived in one, I want to say, because she was kind of blinded at the fact that our family is the farthest thing from a romantic novel. And I'll be the first to admit that. And again, in her eyes, my mother could do no wrong, and my mother was a perfect angel. Now, my mother, whom I respect, of course, and I love, she's my mom, I can be the first to admit that, no one's perfect. Sometimes people make mistakes. My mother is no different than anybody else. I got to remember the fact that my mother was 16, 17 when she had me. So she had a lot of growing up to do. But one of the stories I used to like to listen to my grandmother tell is about how almost everybody in the family has had this supernatural kind of connection to the supernatural. And not only did my grandmother tell me these stories, but also my aunt, the eldest of my aunts and uncles, who's still alive, by the way, she tells the story how everyone, that both my grandmother or her mother and then her grandmother were also very much a believer in the supernatural and the paranormal and so forth as they witnessed things. I am someone that I need to see something in order to believe it to be true. I'm sorry if that offends somebody, but that's how it is. But in the same sense, don't look at me funny, but on that same sense, if I see it or I can't explain it, then I can't deny it either. If you can read between the lines on that one. But the other part about it is, the connection with things that we, the various different connections to nature and the supernatural that our family seems to have. Me, myself, at a very young age, I was clairvoyant. I still am. I only talk about this stuff around this time of the year because it's stuff that I personally don't need to broadcast all over the place. Now, granted, I'm broadcasting it right now, but this is the time for that stuff, and this is the season for that. And I would much rather tell you guys the facts of that stuff than sensationalize it and make it to be some type of gift or some type of fantastical thing. When in reality, it's really not. Being clairvoyant is absolutely a curse, in my opinion. And I've had it my entire life. Now, for those people who don't really understand what clairvoyance is the ability to not only see, but also communicate with the supernatural, if you would. And sadly, I am someone who's been doing that for a number of years, and the reason why I know how I can tell someone who really is clairvoyant versus someone who's pretending to be or claims to be is how they feel about it and how their demeanor is towards it. Like me, myself, I see it as a burden like you wouldn't believe. But there are people out there who claim to be also clairvoyant, but there's also these little pieces here and there that just don't fit that narrative. For example, people who claim to have mastered the art of, not talking to them when they don't want to be talked to, and some other random made-up mumbo-jumbo that just isn't reality. Now, to someone who isn't clairvoyant, none of it sounds real, and it all sounds fictitious. But let me give you an example of what it's like to be clairvoyant, and you guys can be the judge on how great it really is. Being the fact that you're clairvoyant means that these supernatural things, let's say ghosts, okay, they're drawn to you because they know that you can communicate with them sometimes. Sometimes they don't. And here's the thing. This is why I know there's issues with people who claim to be clairvoyant. People come in all shapes, sizes, cultures, and so forth. The same thing goes for the supernatural. If someone goes from living to non-living, right, then that doesn't change who they are or what language they speak. They don't magically speak your language because they are passed on to the other world or in the middle of whatever it is. So that's the first thing that I have to say. So if you hear someone who runs into these beings, these ghosts, if you would, and it's amazing how they can communicate with every single one of them or some of them, but in reality, if they know that you can communicate with them, they will talk to you, and they are pretty honest, and they don't really lie. They can be some jerks, but here's the thing. Because of the fact that sadly, I only really speak English. I'm learning other languages. I know a little bit of Italian, a little bit of Russian, a little bit of French, a little bit of Gaelic, which is even tougher than that. a little bit of Spanish. So I'm literally learning various different languages just because I have friends all over the world, and I feel that it's necessary to and I like to communicate with people. I like to show people respect by learning their cultures and their languages when I communicate with them. But my languages, my skill level for any of those other languages are not enough to hold a conversation. So when a spirit or entity, is other cultures, like, a Spanish or something I can't really fully comprehend. Now, if my wife is there, I can ask her because she is aware of my clairvoyance, as the kids are, as the kids have this as well. My wife is someone who is also someone who is an empath, as they call it. She can feel things, and she can be affected by such things. My daughter and my son have other types of things that they are gifted with. But I'm not about to tell you guys all of their stuff. I'm just talking about me at the moment. It's a hereditary, folks. But anyway, but in layman's terms, I only speak English, so I can only really communicate with English-speaking entities. And people who claim that all these supernatural ghosts just come over and start talking to you, if they know that you can talk to them, sure. If they know that you're aware that they're there, because in all honesty, I could tell you something that'll absolutely freak you all out. I mean, it is the spookiest time of the year. So let me give you this information. Any one single person, wherever you are right now, look around you. And the fun fact is, for any one person, there's usually about maybe 4 or 5 people around those one persons. And it's not like these other people who, let me call out a name, a number, and I think they call it cold reading or whatever. It's not about that at all. It's just wherever anyone walks, there's always at least 4, 5, 6 people around each person anywhere they go. How do I know that? Because every single person I encounter who are human, who are still alive, have these people around them. And the people who are living just are not aware that they are there. And then it's up to me if I acknowledge them or not. And that's another thing too. You can choose to ignore them or tell them, you don't really want to chat with them at that particular time. I don't know so much if you can, use it I don't know about the whole using it in your mind to talk to them. You say it out loud like you would anybody else that you encounter. You just have to do it in a sneaky way because otherwise people think you're talking to yourself. If you've ever encountered me before, and if I'll start talking to you guys directly, I usually make eye contact with you, and I'll talk with you, and so forth. If I break off in a conversation, it's because usually one of the other people around you is talking to me at the time, and I'm deciding whether or not to bring it up to you or not. I know, now you guys are all looking over your shoulders right now. But that's just how that is, and there's nothing wrong with that, because if they wanted to hurt you, they would have, but they obviously don't. And I can't speak to the fact that they are good, bad, and different. They don't seem to bother anybody. In all honesty, I know that it's a fictitious movie, but The Sixth Sense kind of has it correct. That's kind of how it is. And it could possibly be why The Sixth Sense was my favorite film for a long time before the movie Real Steel came out. M. Night Shyamalan, I don't know how he did any of this research or how he knows what this is like, but pretty much what Cole Sear, played by Haley Joel Osment, portrays in this film is kind of how it works. That's kind of how you see everything and everyone. You see them, how they died. You see them. There is no magically they transform back to who they were or whatnot. A better story maybe that is a different type of newer horror. Now, I know a lot of people are either on board or off board with Stephen King. Stephen King came out with a book recently called Later. If anyone's ever read it, then you could probably understand the premise. It sounds very similar to The Sixth Sense, except what he talks about in that movie. Now, again, this is a fictitious person in Later in The Sixth Sense. So is Haley Joel Osment's character, Cole Sear, for that matter. Neither one are based on a true story. But the idea of the clairvoyance, that's kind of what clairvoyance is. And I want you to think of this now. Wherever you go, anywhere, there are no boundaries. And that's why I scoff at people who say that they can put up some type of magical wall that they can't penetrate and they can't come in. Get out of here. There's no such thing. If they want to come in, they're going to come in. You have no privacy. They have no tact. So, and I'm talking about the supernatural. So when anybody who sits there and says, oh, you know, I got this wall that I have coming up here and I feel a cold spot, most likely if you feel a cold spot, I not only have felt the cold spot, but I've probably already talked to whoever it is that's there. Because I already felt that a long time ago. Feeling it's one thing. Seeing them, talking to them, communicating with them is a completely different story. But if you'd like to do research for yourself or get a better understanding of it, granted, it is a fictitious story later, but I really think that Stephen King nailed what clairvoyance is in the book Later. Fantastic book, and again, it's something that I can identify with, and also how others treat you when either they know or you know, because that's also real, right? Growing up, everyone in our family kind of understood the supernatural because that was our kind of how we grew up. My grandmother, her grandmother, and it goes on and on and on. That all the people who have had this ability, all these people who have these various different, whatever the case may be, all these different. I say a curses, honestly. I don't see it as a gift or anything good to have. They've not helped me any, that's for sure. But you know, that's my experience with them. Everyone's different, I suppose. But that's when I just get annoyed when I hear people who talk about clairvoyance as if, you know, it's a great gift, and like you see these people like John Edwards and all these other people who claim to communicate with the dead, but of course they need to, you know, they only know a first letter and a first name, and it's really a fishing game. You know, they're waiting for someone to say, oh, I know, you know, you go into a room of people and you yell out, oh, I'm getting a sign, someone with a J. Does anybody know anybody with a J? And then someone will raise their hand, which, by the way, I mean, facts of the matter is that a lot of names begin with a J or a D, so a lot of these supposed psychics will pull random letters that are very common with most names that begin with that letter. For example, an A or a C or an S, you know, that is honestly how that works. They call it cold reading. So they'll go into a room and they'll say, hey, I'm seeing, you know, a person, they're telling me a name or a letter, and that's not how the supernatural works, folks. They tell you the name if they want to tell you. You can ask them if they really want to. So let's not be stupid about it. Let's not, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to people who try to do this or claim to have this, but the reality of it is there's no, you know, making deals and somehow getting information from the supernatural that'll somehow contribute to your life or theirs. I mean, they don't have a life anymore. which is tragic and sad. And I got to tell you, that's partly for me why I feel so strongly and why it's such a heart thing for me. Because generally speaking, I feel the spirit world is kind of like animals. And animals are drawn to me too. Animals, spirits, people are drawn to me for the most part. And it's just I have to make a decision whether or not to get involved with those or not. And some are tragic and sad. I'm talking about young ghosts. Ghosts come and spirits come in all shapes and sizes, ages, races. And I don't discriminate if I'm going to chat with someone or if I'm going to talk to one of them and make them feel better. If there is feeling better. I mean, I've never... I don't think you would know if it makes them feel better or not. Other than, they feel content after communication with you. And, that's kind of my experience with it. I want you to picture like talking to a friend of yours at school who's having a rough day. And after you're done talking, your friend goes their way and you go your way. That's kind of how it is. It's not like, they're going to stay there and chat with you all day. Again, there's 700 other people around at the same time, walking down the street, walking anywhere. I see them everywhere. They're not just, in houses. It's not at night. This is another fallacy. We're going to talk about, horror movie myths and cliches a little later on. When we start talking about horror movies, but in depth. But in general, growing up, I was very intrigued by the supernatural because, again, it was my culture, it was my heritage, and my grandmother would tell stories of it. And I don't know if it was to make me feel better that I wasn't losing my young mind. I was very young when my grandmother and my aunts and my mother even realized that, I also had this ability to, or curse, I should say, to see and communicate and talk with them. And they're drawn to me. And I'm going to tell a story real quick. Probably one of the most... I'm trying to think of what the feeling was in the end. See, I've been dealing with this for so long that, in all retrospect, I think over the years, it's definitely gotten stronger and better. Not better, but stronger in the ability to be able to, for myself, have more of the fact that I know how to but I know how, and I know I'm going to be okay because I know there are certain spirits and entities that will also watch over me. If that makes any sense. I'm going to give you an example, and this is, since it's Halloween, what a perfect time for this story. So, you guys had heard that I left home at a very young age. Now, what I didn't tell you guys is for a short time, I attempted to stay with someone in my blood, cousin, who, traditionally speaking, growing up, we did not get along well. But she had an extra room, and I needed a place. I was young. Remember, I was 15, 16 at this particular time. I was, about 17, I was emancipated. So I moved in shortly after that. While I was living there, now that was my grandmother's house prior. That was actually the house where I grew up in. I knew that house to be my grandmother's house. But what I didn't remember is whose room was whose or anything else like the layouts. And the other part was where my grandmother was and where I grew up was on the second floor, on top of, the second floor, above where my cousin was, and that's where I was living. And one of the interesting times, I think this is pretty much around the time when my aunt, my cousin's mother and some other aunts kind of figured out that I was clairvoyant like they were, or that I also had this, is I was I had just moved into that, into the room there with my cousin, and almost immediately, my grandmother would visit me, and there were nice visits for the most part. Chatted about things, and she warned me that this is not going to work well. She told me that not to trust any of this. She said there's two-faced snakes, and that's what she called people who couldn't be trustworthy. It was a two-faced snake or a two-headed snake. Someone who lied, or someone who was manipulative, someone who had an alternative motive. She called those two-headed snakes. Again, she's Celtic, folks. And she would tell those stories while, she had been gone at this particular time when I was about 13. But she would come to me almost nightly, usually, between 11 and about 1 a.m. And this was a regular thing while I was there. Now, the thing that I didn't like, as I mentioned before, ghosts, spirits don't have a filter. There is no privacy, and they don't have any kind of there's no such thing as a wall to put up for yourself that will keep them away. They're going to come for you regardless where you are and how you're doing things. We'll get into that when we talk about horror movies, because a lot of these old things you see in these horror movies are just, you shake your head at where your logic is. But, oddly enough, this, I was about 17 there, and I started coming down with really bad insomnia around the same time because, I got my grandmother visiting me on a regular basis at night. I mean, you don't want to be rude, not just, whatever. But then what would start to happen is my grandmother, wasn't there for a short time, and then all of a sudden this guy started coming. I didn't know who this guy was. I don't remember him. Some guy kept on coming and giving me a hard time, and he was not a pleasant looking individual, nor was he a pleasant individual. He was humiliating, he was insulting, talked about my mother, talked about me, talked about this one and that one. He was a nasty character. But what was interesting is whenever he got really close or really dangerous, and this is why a lot of people who are why these people who claim to be clairvoyant make no sense to me, because they make it sound like there's only one spirit or ghost at a time and that none of these people see each other, and that's not true. Ghosts, spirits are very much aware of each other. And there were many a times where I thought he was going to get hurt. He was, getting really over the top. And he was starting to I wasn't liking him at all. And my grandmother would start coming and chasing him out of the room. And he listened because that was his sister. Because at that time, I didn't know who this guy was yet. And I asked my aunt. This is actually how my aunt found out that I was clairvoyant. Because I asked her if she knew a guy that looked like this, and I described this guy. And, I described this guy, curly hair, kind of skinny and frail, had a long, sore neck, if you would, and not a pleasant individual. And my Aunt Barbara told me that was... She said that's your Uncle Danny, but you couldn't know who that is. He died before you were even... He died just before you were born. But apparently, where I was... that room that I was sleeping in was apparently his room. And my grandmother, who owned the house, would chase him out of that room that I was in at that particular time, and I am living, and he is no longer. And there's a lot of mystery behind him, Uncle Danny. He had a very tragic ending. Ended violently, and I'm not going to disparage that. But it was not a good way, which explains the sore neck kind of an idea. and whatnot. But that was my first experience where I actually saw my grandmother, who stepped in multiple times to chase him out of the way from me and get rid of him from my area. So, yes, ghosts do interact with each other. So that's a fallacy that they do not. Because I've seen it. Because my grandmother chased him out whenever he got really belligerent, really nasty. She would chase him right out of the room. And he wasn't going to second guess her because no one talked back to my grandmother. So that is a little bit of history of my family. I talked before about how we were very connected with nature. Animals, especially wild animals. Most people in my mother's side have some type of animal that are connects with more. My uncle, my mother's twin, had chipmunks. I had another uncle who could get any dog or a wolf or a coyote or whatever the dog breed was. They were drawn to my uncle, or cats for that matter, drawn to my uncle. My mother's twin, as I said, had chipmunks, squirrels, and so forth. Dogs. My mother had a blue jay that would, she helped take care of it when it was young. She helped fix its wing when it fell out of the nest. And I guess it saw loyalty to her, so it would come down and land on her shoulder. My Aunt Eleanor actually has a picture, or had a picture, I should say, of this bird sitting on my mother's shoulder. And I thought it was a joke. My mother was someone who you had to question how much she was being real and how much she was being funny. My mother had a very interesting sense of humor. But in hindsight, my Aunt Eleanor had pictures of this bird sitting on my mother's shoulder, so it was a real thing. Apparently the other thing was when we had the dogs, and there were dogs that my mother had, there was several her family had. He, apparently whenever they would get out of the house or out of what they called the dog run, which was like a little side yard made for dogs, my mother would be the only one the dogs would come back to. So that was another one of those things. So I told this story before, it's the random animals that are drawn to me. The animals that I'm not overly fond of are drawn to me. I respect all nature and all that stuff and whatnot, but I'm not overly fond of some of the things that really enjoy me, like for example, my first wild animal pet, if you want to call it that, something that was drawn to me at a young age, was a muskrat. I cringe now that when I think of it. I'm wondering if I was to go back in time when that was like fourth grade. Yeah, 4th and 5th grade, I had this pet muskrat. A muskrat basically is a giant river rat, and it had an odor to it, and it lived right on the waterway, right down behind, like down the park, down the street from our house. And this is the same river that my brothers, had everyone convinced that had an orca whale in it. Which, by the way, I can tell you that is fictitious. That's not. I don't know what my brother was seeing, but it was not an orca whale. And people got upset with me when I told them at elementary school age, that there is no way an orca whale could live in this little river here. But I'm the bad guy for that. But what I wasn't the bad guy for is the fact that this muskrat that lived in this park down there, had a fondness for me. So whenever I'd be at the park to hang out or whatever the case may be, the muskrat would come and hang out with me, sit next to me, and kind of curl up next to me. Now me, my age now, I probably wouldn't be down for any of that right now. Back then I was a little kid and I didn't know any better to have this wild rat. Basically, it's a rat. I mean, let's call it what it is. And later they would become snake food. No offense to those people who are squeamish, but reality. I did have snakes growing up, as I mentioned before, and I also have a fondness for the animals that are often misunderstood. Sharks, spiders, snakes, lizards, and so forth. a lot of my younger days were spent, dealing with the supposed creepy crawlers. You know what? I'll tell you this. As far as, who I'd rather spend time with, I would much rather spend time in the backyard hanging out with a salamander than hanging inside the house with the people in my family, because the salamander at least isn't kind of a jerk. It doesn't insult me, it doesn't make me feel bad about being me. It's a salamander. So there you go. So I think that's enough creepy crawly talk and enough about clairvoyance. So the moral of that story with my grandmother is the fact that she chased my uncle away, and I didn't even know he was my uncle until someone confirmed that he was my uncle. And again, I had never met him before, so I wouldn't know him anyway. But that's how that worked. And so, debunking fake, clairvoyants who claim that, they only can see certain things or only get letters. It's nonsense. They're either talking to you or they're not. So that's how that works. I saw someone try to, and if it's over the phone, there's no way it's going to happen. Or internet or anything like that. That's not how that works. So, there you go. All right, let's move on to the next subject, Ants. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So this part's going to be a little fun. Someone had mentioned not long ago about a famous Russian poet, Pushkin. Hold on one second. For those people who maybe don't know, I did go to film school, and I did like writing, and writing has always been something I've always been very, very fond of. Yeah. Give me 1 second, folks. Yeah, Pushkin, I was right. So Russian poet Pushkin, also you probably heard of William Shakespeare and so forth and so on, Socrates. There are so many well-known poets in the world. But when you want to talk about, the traditional horror, right? There are a lot of people who are inspired and drew inspiration from probably the king of Goth himself, and someone who a lot of people claim to be the father of modern horror in literary form, and that being Edgar Allan Poe, fellow Bostonian, by the way. So before I get into reading one of his most famous works, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I know about Edgar Allan Poe and why he is an important figure. And some things maybe you don't know about Edgar Allan Poe that might surprise you, that I know plenty about. For one thing, Edgar Allan Poe, I think the interesting thing to say about Edgar Allan Poe is the fact that he, when his time was up, he died literally, as tragic as it sounds, he died poor, homeless on the street. And that is true of Edgar Allan Poe. That's how his time came to an end. And the other sad part is Edgar Allan Poe would never realize or never become known for his writing or become the well-known writer that he is until after his death. And that's tragic and sad. He never got to see his success. He never got to profit from his success. So all of the works that Edgar Allan Poe did were things that ultimately didn't sell well, or they weren't things that you could really sell anyway. He died broke, and he died literally in the street. Now, a lot of people have heard stories of Edgar Allan Poe. I'm sure most of them are probably accurate. What you might not know is that Edgar Allan Poe served in the military, and that he was stationed at a place called Fort Independence that was located in South Boston, Massachusetts. Edgar Allan Poe, by the way, again, in case you didn't know, was born in Boston, Massachusetts. What you might not know also is that Edgar Allan Poe absolutely despised war, and he didn't want any part of being in the service, but he was in it anyway, so he was there. And one of the things that was interesting about Edgar Allan Poe, stationed at Fort Independence in South Boston, which back then it was literally an island, which now we know that area as Castle Island, and it's actually connected to South Boston via roadway. You can literally drive right from Boston Southie onto Castle Island, and you could walk around the same grounds and tour the fort that I've done multiple times growing up. Fun fact, I like going to museums and learning about culture and history and so forth, because ultimately we all came from somewhere, and I think it's important to kind of learn those different places and backgrounds and the people of which that make our foundation of our everyday things. I think history and culture are two of the most important things that everyone should really learn more about. That would probably lessen things like stigma, racism, and naiveness, and false narratives that people have of people if you just gave cultures and people a chance to learn. So growing up, I did a lot of these tours at Fort Independence at Castle Island. And one of the well-known stories that they told was that while Edgar Allan Poe was stationed there at Fort Independence, he drew inspiration from an actual event that took place right there in Castle Island, or Fort Independence. For those people who have never read Edgar Allan Poe's short story Cask of the Amontillado, I always mispronounce this thing. Hold on one second. I hate this. Ever since I was a younger person, I can never pronounce this story. And it makes me sad because it is one of the most well-known Edgar Allan Poe stories. Alright, one second, folks. I'm going to tell you the name of this. Bear with me, folks. Okay, Cask of the Amontillado. I'm horrible at pronouncing this. Ever since I was a kid, I couldn't. The Cask of Amontillado, let me just tell you the basics of it. In the story, a jester actually annoys this very well-classed individual, and what the gentleman does to get back at this jester is he takes this jester and gets him drunk, and he takes him down to this building and basically chains him to a wall, and then puts up a brick wall, literally burying him within the walls. What's interesting about that is that Edgar Allan Poe heard this story that actually happened at Castle Island at Fort Independence. And I'm going to tell you guys that story that I've been told multiple times because I remember it well. So the story went that there was a sea captain that was very popular with the crew members and a very big, burly, strong guy. Loved to fight, very much of a drinker and everything else. He was he was a sailor, he was a tough guy, he was an admiral, all these things, right? Well, this younger guy came in to Castle Island, took rank. And the people love him now. He was a newer captain. He was younger. He was good looking. People genuinely liked his company. Now, the admiral was a little bit more of a brute kind of a guy. He was not a fun and games kind of a person. He was kind of serious. So the crew actually liked this younger guy. So what ended up happening is the older admiral became frustrated with the younger popular gentleman or officer. There was a duel between the two, and the not as popular guy ended up killing the popular admiral in combat. It was like a duel kind of a thing. This is a thing that actually happened. Now the crew and the people and the soldiers got upset about this because they liked the guy, and the other guy was very much nicer than the admiral, who was kind of he was kind of a burly, wise guy, bully kind of a type. So what the other crew members decided to do is they decided to get this guy. They came up with this plan to get this guy drunk, the admiral, get him drunk, take him into one of the magazines, which a magazine, by the way, is one of the tunnels which are in Fort Independence. It's where they would keep and store all of their goods, like their artillery, their guns, rifles, bullets, and what have you. And they took this admiral, got him nice and drunk. Again, he liked to drink anyway. They got him nice and drunk, brought him into this magazine, chained him to the wall while he was drunk. And again, he thought it was all fun and games until the crew began to brick up the wall in front of him and around him. They literally buried him in the wall. Edgar Allan Poe heard this story that everyone told about what just happened there not long before he got there. And that's how he got inspiration for Cask of the Amontillado. It's based on an actual story that happened in Boston at Fort Independence. And if you go to do the tour, they'll even show you where that took place. And yes, folks, they did find the body eventually. It was a real story. So that's a fun Edgar Allan Poe factoid that you didn't ask for that I gave it to you. And the fact that Edgar Allan Poe died, really not getting the recognition that he now is known for. He's known as the father of modern horror. He has inspired authors like Stephen King and Anne Rice and countless other authors in the genre. Someone that was right up there with him, someone that he critiqued a lot of his early work was H.P. Lovecraft, which is interesting because H.P. Lovecraft was a Rhode Island staple, which is just south of Boston, or south of Massachusetts, really. Now, a lot of people, really accustom, Edgar Allan Poe to Baltimore because that's where he was most of his life, which is where he met the love of his life. I'm going to leave out those details because those are not as flattering as the accomplishments. And we're not about, celebrating someone's downfalls. But the fact of the matter is that without Edgar Allan Poe and his dark and dreary outlook and his brilliance, there wouldn't be authors like Stephen King or Anne Rice or any of these other Dean Koontz or all these other horror writers that are out there now. Even R.L. Stine. Many people drew inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe, and he was someone a lot of people respected. One of the things that he did was people would, he would critique people's works in the newspaper. He was an early literary editor. He was one of the first literary critics, because remember, movies didn't exist yet. Television didn't exist yet. But what he would do is he would critique other people's works, like H.P. Lovecraft or other writers at that time, which sometimes got him, sometimes he, had a tendency to be a little bit hardcore on his views on people's writing, but he didn't, that he was respected for that, his opinion and so forth. But sadly, again, Edgar Allan Poe really was gone before his legacy really began. So what I'm going to do for you guys, which, is going to be interesting and never done before, I'm going to read you guys his most famous poem and one of our family favorites. And if you've ever seen The Simpsons, you might have heard of this one. It's called The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And I'm going to drink my water real quick because this is going to be interesting. I'm going to even try to do my best narration voice for this, so bear with me. Here we go. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. I want to point out before I read this, this is in public domain because this was written like 19 or 18. Hold on one second. I'll tell you exactly when this went to public domain. This was first finished in 1845. So yeah, it surpassed the public domain thing. So no copyrights, people. Thank you very much. Here we go. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I ponder, weak and weary, over many quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there became a tapping, as of those one gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this is in nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was the bleak December, and each separate dying amber wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I sought to borrow from my book's surcase of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here for evermore. In the silken sadness, uncertain rustling of each purple's curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terror never felt before, so that now to still that beating of my heart, I still stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This is and nothing more." Precisely my soul grew stronger, hesitation then no longer. Sir, said I, or "Madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact I was napping, and gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door, darkness there, and nevermore. Deep into the darkness peering long I stood, there wandering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal had ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave me no token. And the only word that was spoken was the whisper word, "Lenore." This I whispered in the echo murmur back the word, "Lenore." Merely this and nevermore. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I hear a tapping, somewhat louder than before. Surely, I said, surely this is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what Tratis the mysteries explore. Let my heart still a moment, and the mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nevermore. I open here, I flung the shutter. I open here and I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt in the flutter, in there I stepped in stately raven on the saintly days of yore. Not the least obedience made he, not a minute stopping or stay he. But when with mane of lore and lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon the bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird belingled in sad fancy into smile, but by the grave and stern decorum of the contents of war. Through thy chest be shorn and shaven thou, I said, art sure no craven. Ghastly grim ancient raven, wonder in the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is, night plantain shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled, this ungainly fowl, to hear discord of plain thought is answer little meaning. Little reverence bore, for we cannot help agree with no living being. Even yet was blessed with seeing birds above this chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculpture bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven sat sitting lonely in the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that word he did outpour. Nothing further than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till scarcely then he muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as he hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Startled in the stillness broken by reply, so abruptly spoken, doubted I said I, what I utters is its own stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast in her faster, till the song one burden bore, till the drenges of his hope and melancholy burden bore, or nevermore. But the raven still belingled up all my fancy into smile, straight wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird, in the bust on the door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself a linking fancy into fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly gunt, ominous bird of yore, meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into the bosom core. It's this and more I sat divining, with my head in easing reclining, on the cushion's velvet lining, the lamplight goading but the velvet violent lining of the lamp lighting goading she shall press nevermore. Then methought the eyes grew denser, perfume from the unseen Caesar, swung by Sapphire, whose footfalls tinkled on the tuft floor. Wrench, I cried, thy God hath thee. By these angels he hath sent thee. Respite the Nephilim from the memory of Lenore. Quoth, this kind of Nephith I forgot, this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, I say, thing of evil, prophet I still, if bird or devil, whether temper sent, or whether tempter tossed thee, here ashore, desolate yet undaunted, on his desert land enchanted, on his home of horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, I say, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by heaven that bends us, by God we both adore, tell his soul with sorrow leaden if, within the distant Eden it shall clasp the sainted maiden, whose angel name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whose angel's name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be thy word, thy sign of parting, bird or friend, I shriek upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest of the night plantous shore. Leave no black perfume in token, in lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit thy bust upon my door. Take thy beak from me out of my heart, and take thy form off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven never flittered, still is sitting on the pillared bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all seemed of the demons in the dreaming. The lamp lights him steaming, throws his shadow on the floor. In my soul, from out thy shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. Again, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Thank you. That concludes my reading of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Quoth the raven, nevermore. enjoyed the reading of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, the Boston bad boy of horror, who inspired many writers in the horror genre. But we're going to leave the book stuff and talk about the film stuff and the television stuff. I honestly have often wondered if I am someone who truly sees the good in people or anyone. As a young person growing up, watching horror films with my mother, that was my mother thing. My mother loved horror, and she saw the humor in things that most didn't find humor in. A lot of people said that my mother would have a nervous laugh, which I can understand. I guess I also have a tendency to laugh out of nervousness in certain situations and so forth, where most people would be upset. But horror movies have never really impacted me like anything else. And honestly, horror movies really have not bothered me too much. First, before I start talking about horror films, I wanted to break down kind of the difference between like a horror film and a slasher film and, the various different genres of horror. So a slasher film, which, is meant for terror, is meant to follow a protagonist who's going to go around slaying people with a lot of stabbing and violence and so forth. A lot of visuals. That's a slasher film. But a horror film, really its purpose is to play with the emotion of fear. It is to extract the feeling of fear from the audience, is ultimately what the goal of a horror film should be. Now, modern horror, a lot of people are familiar with things like The Conjuring and the Insidious movies and these jump scares that come out of nowhere. The Jordan Peele things, the home invasion things. But there's all kinds of different elements of horror, and, sometimes it's who can give you the most without, that director or that film that's willing to go to that extra mile, take you right up to the edge as far as they can go legally, and then just drop you into that field of horror. Films that are there are some films in the horror genre that are so horrific and grotesque that they come into what they call the body horror genre, or the gore factor. Things like Saw, for example, would fall into that category, or The Fly. Things that rely heavily on body makeup and a lot of grotesque type of things to make the audience uncomfortable watching someone in peril. That's kind of those genres. Things like Hostel would fall under that category, as well as some other films. But, because, granted, I like all films. I appreciate comedy, action, drama, funny comedies. I even like an occasional rom-com. I'm not afraid to admit that. There are some films I enjoy that are considered to be, quote, chick flicks. But I don't think that there should be any kind of a label on a film. A label, if it's a good film, who cares who's watching it? And the horror community is the same thing. I'll give anything a chance at least once. And then there are some films I'll never watch again. There are a lot of films that I feel are a lot of overrated ones. I did a list, if you guys remember, not long ago, of the most overrated horror movies of all time. I'm wondering if I have that handy. One second, folks. I had a list. I think I might still have a list. Well, I'm not going to give you the whole list again because it's kind of pointless. But what I did want to highlight is a few of the ones that a lot of people make a big deal about that I personally am not overly sold on. And, one of that being The Exorcist, for example. I find The Exorcist is not as scary as people make it out to be. But then, here I am trying to analyze why is it that Exorcist doesn't have this effect on me? Why do I see the humor in it because there are certain dialogues, there's certain scenes, there's certain like verbiage that is used in The Exorcist that strikes me as funny and comical. A lot of people wonder, well, are you religious? Do you believe in God or anything like that? And the honest truth behind that is I don't judge others for what they believe. I grew up going to church. My family forced me to go to church. I was raised Catholic, and I was, forced to go to 4 o'clock Mass on Saturday or Sunday. God was a very big thing. I had 2 aunts who were in the choir. One of the cool things is I've talked before about being musically inclined. I learned how to play the piano, self-taught, at a young age, and one of the cool things was when my aunts were in the choir, if the organist couldn't be there to perform, whether it be they'd be sick or whatever else for the practice, I would actually get to play the church organ for the choir. So I thought that was a huge deal. And I ever play one of those Gothic type organs, it was an amazing feeling just to play a huge instrument. So that was kind of cool. But as far as, this is a film. I don't think this film has anything to do with a religion. Granted, it's dealing with possession and the Catholics having to get permission to form a religious ceremony. But, here's the thing about the movie. In doing research in years past and so forth, what I know of exorcisms are, generally speaking, a lot of people who, believe people are being possessed or whatnot. A lot of them can be easily led, and it can be easily explained as mental illness or various other diseases, epilepsy, and there are a lot of scientific and medical research that actually supports that. There is actually studies that, where, and successfully, by the way, I'm sure you guys might have seen the film, the Exorcism of Emily Rose, right? Well, that's a true story. That's based on a true story, and the reality of it is all of these priests and all these other people literally tried to do these exorcisms on this poor girl instead of getting her to an actual doctor and getting her actual help. They pursued doing these exorcisms while, in the autopsy she had epilepsy and she had she had a couple other different things going on. So what ended up happening was she ended up dying as a result of those exorcisms, and her family sued the churches and so forth. And that's the real story of the Exorcism of Emily Rose. A lot of the times when people claim to be possessed or they claim they need an exorcism, a lot of it comes down to mental health or epilepsy. That's why a lot of the times the churches are hesitant to pursue this religious ceremony, theoretically. I don't judge people for what they believe and what they don't believe. But what I do believe and what I know is that The Exorcist is a film that is based on a book. And, of course, a lot of things had to be changed from the book to the movie. For example, in the book, in the actual story of The Exorcist, is a boy and not a girl. Also, the exorcisms, most of them took place in a hospital, not at home, like it did in The Exorcist. To my knowledge, the boy's head did not go 360 around like it did with Linda Blair. But, I mean, a lot of the other things, depending on what you believe, took place within the book of The Exorcist. But here's the thing about it. There's dialogue we're talking about the movie itself. It honestly has some comical elements. There's some dialogue that seems obscure. Could it be Could it be that it's so obscure that it makes you chuckle? It's a possibility. The demon in the movie definitely has some great one-liners. But ultimately, a lot of people praise this as the best horror film of all time. And I think that for myself, I can't tell you that this is the greatest film from all time. I can tell you it's the most overrated movie. Do I think it's impactful? Do I think it's huge for, relevancy purposes? Absolutely. Because without The Exorcist, none of these other exorcism movies would be relevant, nor would anybody attempt these other exorcism movies years after the original. It's kind of one of those things where everyone sees someone's success in one thing, and rather than do something different or come up with your own idea, they're going to take that idea and just change it here and there a bit. Kind of like the game of telephone, right? So everyone's sitting around in a circle, right? All these filmmakers are sitting around in a circle. Let's make a movie. And the one person says, I'm going to make The Exorcist. And then he whispers to the guy next to him. He says, I'm going to make The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Then another one's going to say, I'm going to make The Demon. I'm going to make Eat, Pray, Love. I'm going to make The Exorcism of Emily Rose. I'm going to make Deliver Us from Evil. I'm going to make, and so forth and so on, all the way back to the original. Now we're back to The Exorcist again. And it's just, we don't need it. It's just the same thing over and over again. And one of the biggest problems with modern horror is a lot of the stuff currently that is being offered is either a sequel to a film that has already existed, a prequel to something that existed for years that never needed a backstory or no one ever asked for a prequel to, or it's a rebranding of another classic. For example, Halloween. Halloween got a reboot, if you would. The newest installment of the Halloween series, Halloween, Evil Dead, the last three that just came out. There's three of them. Story-wise, it really went far off from left field from the rest of it. Basically, with that film, those three movies did is it basically got rid of the entire series after Halloween 1, because theoretically, this is supposed to be the universe where Laurie Strode is just some babysitter that Michael Myers is, for whatever reason, infatuated with. The one that got away, I guess. But I'm going to ask a few questions here, and people, these are the cliches in horror films. A lot of people who are horror fans will often overlook, or they'll try to justify. But someone like myself who loves horror movies can see those things and then add questions to it, like why and what, the reasoning. And I think for me, a lot of it comes down to what goes on in reality. How would I really react to this? How, if you guys remember, a while back I had my friend Tim come on the show, and his son's just getting into horror here and there, and Tim's a huge horror fan, sci-fi fan. And I've had other people on the show also who are horror fans. But for me, I think that one of the things that I really like in horror is something different and fresh. Or something that goes really left field. Something that catches me by surprise that doesn't follow the same formula. I like something that is different than what I am offered currently. For example, The Prodigy, starring Jackson Robert Scott and multiple other people. That was a fantastic horror film. A lot of people didn't really give it as much praise as I give it. But let me tell you why I like The Prodigy. The Prodigy took an original story idea, and it didn't have that cliche ending. That was what made it special and fresh. Another movie that comes to mind is Brightburn, which was another, film horror genre. What if Superman came to Earth and wasn't as nice as he claimed to be? That's a great story idea. Great different take on the idea. What if, right? And there are some other films that I really enjoyed also. Now, admittedly, I really did enjoy The Conjuring, the first one. And I also did enjoy the Insidious movies. Now, I think Insidious might be one of the most underrated of the horror genre currently. The reason why I say the Insidious movies are fantastic and how they're done is because if you can watch any movie out of order, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, any of those films, you can watch one or whatever other part of those series and probably catch up pretty quick, and you don't really need to watch the other ones. Insidious is actually different than that. Insidious is smart for this, in the sense that with Insidious, what they explore is if you miss something, it might be part of that story arc. I don't want to spoil a lot, because I do think the Insidious might be one of the most geniusly made movies that doesn't get as much credit as it does, because of how they can have one moment that looks like nothing at the moment, but then in a big reveal later on, as the story progresses, you're like, oh, now that makes sense. And it's not done like M. Night Shyamalan, where it's a blatant, plot twist. It's done in the sense where everything that goes on in the Insidious universe, you kind of have to pay attention to, because you very well might encounter it later on within the series. Maybe not even in that movie, but in the second one, much like we saw with Insidious 2. Really well done, I gotta say. So, I really wanted to acknowledge that part of it. So, I think Insidious is one of those modern day horror movies that doesn't go under the radar because it's not rated R. And it's easy to make jokes about the jump scares, but what I think it does really well with is the fact that it really, little pieces you might see throughout the film might pop up later on, and it makes sense. Everything has a purpose within the Insidious universe. There's a scene or a story arc that all follows together. Really smart stuff. I got to give credit to the people making Insidious. Now, is it also interesting that Patrick Wilson is the leader in both of those film series? He's both in Insidious and in the Conjuring universe. I think Patrick Wilson has a lot going on right now, and I think he's got a lot of promise going forward. And I look forward to seeing what he's going to do next. I'm understanding that there's going to be a new Insidious, a new Conjuring movie. We just had The Nun 2, and I don't think we need any of that. I think the problem with the whole Conjuring universe is I think a lot of people are looking to, since those initial movies came out, people started looking into these Warrens. And Lorraine Warren, to which a lot of these stories come from. Famously, they're tied to, both the Conjuring universe, as well as the Amityville universe, as well as the Annabelle universe, as well as the, there's a slew of different stories that, the Warrens are associated with. But, since then, a lot of people, there are some people who say, oh, these things never happened. But then there are people who say, yes, these things absolutely happened. I think Amityville Horror is a great example of that, where, in some versions, the writer of the book, and George Lutz, kind of mastermind this idea, but then there are yet documentaries and stories from the people who lived there, other than those two, who confirm, these things really did happen. And the same thing can go for the girls who grew up in the Conjuring house, or, the other people who can absolutely vouch with 100% that these things did happen. So I don't know if it's easy to say that these people are frauds if there are so many people that can confirm these things did. Now, a lot of people, the Enfield Ghost is another one where famously a lot of people question the validity of that story, and that would be The Conjuring 2, by the way, for those people who are following along. But in retrospect, there are a lot of people who were there who have merit in what I would can vouch for a lot of those things, who aren't Ed and Lorraine Warren. Recently, I saw a documentary on Netflix about the Devil Made Me Do It case, which famously, again, it's the Warrens, and it's probably one of the most famous court cases of modern time. This is where, Arnie Johnson allegedly killed his landlord in some stories, or a boss in another. There's various different places that this is met. There's different. I've heard different stories of who this person is he killed, and the various different reasons why. A lot of it stems from Arnie Johnson's, I guess, his girlfriend's or wife's younger brother, I think it was possessed, and he, instead of just helping his younger brother out, the young boy out, he felt pity and challenged the devil, and the devil supposedly possessed him. And in the courts, they tried to prove that Arnie did not kill the people on his own will. He was actually possessed by the devil. And by the way, that was ruled to be. He was found guilty, by the way, for those people who have ever wondered. There was no magical moments there. There was no hocus pocus. Legitimately was found guilty of, I think, manslaughter. So don't think that came out to help any. But there's now a documentary about people talking about what happened to that kid who was possessed. And then there's one person in the family who says, no, none of these things happened, but I'm the only one who doesn't believe it happened. But everyone else does. And here's my theory about that. If more than one person can talk about a story cohesively and can tell the same story, and they collaborate the same story, there can't be anything too far off from the truth. Now, it's one thing to spread a rumor with a bunch of people at the same time, but if you have 5 people, and 4 of those 5 people can tell the story the same way in separate areas, and that one person says, no, none of that ever happened, I have to say the chances of the 4 being correct is probably stronger than the one person who isn't. That could be sour grapes. There could be some type of a fallout somewhere. Who knows? But the reality of it is, Arnie Johnson did serve his sentence, was punished for his crime. So it's not like he didn't get punished for the crime that he committed. So the brother who says an innocent man lost his life, which is true, someone did die, but we don't know the validity of that. And there's always 3 sides of every story, folks. But what we do know is the fact that defense did not work, and it never will work, by the way. But when we talk about the cliches in horror movies, we got to talk about the things that everyone has to, turn our senses of reality off. You have to turn, in order to really enjoy a film, you have to turn off that common sense factor that, you hear a noise upstairs or downstairs if you're upstairs, and you're the only person in the house. Depending on what the noise is, you can either go and explore it, or you can, say, see you later, right? That's to someone with sensibility. You hear a noise upstairs, you're the only person in the house. Well, you probably want to leave the house and call 911, get some help. The last thing you're going to do for anyone else is go up there with, whatever, to look around and find out what this noise was. And this is one of those cliches you'll see. Or, I don't know how it is, for example, Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street. Friday the 13th is probably the best example. Has anyone ever seen Jason run after one of these people? I want you to remind you guys that Friday the 13th takes place at a summer camp. Theoretically, at a summer camp, you have, people who are campers. Campers, for the most part, tend to be a little bit more fit than other people, especially if you're a counselor. If you're a counselor, you should probably be a little bit more physically inclined to do the job than someone who is not, right? Your job as a counselor in a camp is to build and mold young minds and keep them healthy and happy and safe. Well, if we're going to look at that, how is it that these camp counselors can barely run? They trip over their own feet. They trip over absolutely nothing that is there. They got to be the biggest klutzes out there. How they lasted as long as they did in reality outside of going to Crystal Lake is beyond me. Because, apparently if they're running down the street, they're going to trip over absolutely nothing and fall on their face 7 times. Because that's just what the movies tell us. And the other part about it is, has anyone ever actually been to summer camp and actually seen some of the counselors? They don't all look like Kevin Bacon and Amy Steele and all these amazing camp counselors we see in these films. Camp counselors tend to be kind of, bland and, not bland, but they're regular people like anybody else. But for some reason, the ones that go to Camp Crystal Lake look like they're, running a modeling camp. Those got to be the most, it looks more like a GQ shoot than a horror film, if you really think about it. But the other thing you got to, question and whatnot, and it's never been explained, Jason Voorhees in the Friday the 13th series. Now, again, I'm probably going to end up spoiling this because, come on, the movie's been out since 1980. It was actually finished filming in 1979, but it came out in 1980. And if you don't know who Jason Voorhees is or Friday the 13th is by now, then I have no idea why we're even talking about horror films. Because anyone who knows anything about horror films or pop culture has heard the name Jason Voorhees. But here's what you mean. Some of the things you might have to question. Like, for example, Jason died supposedly by drowning at Camp Crystal Lake. That's the story that is given. The reason he drowned is because the camp counselors were messing around and not paying attention to Jason, who was drowning in the lake, Camp Crystal Lake. Now, depending on which variation you read or which variation you see, he's either deformed or he's just, incompetent or whatever the case may be. But regardless, every variation takes place with the camp counselors not protecting one of their charges, as they call them, one of the campers, which was at that point was Jason Voorhees. Now I have to tell you, if I sent my son or daughter, in this case my son, because we're talking about Jason, if I'm going to send my son to a summer camp and something was to happen to him because the counselors were messing around and having alone time, we'll say, while my son was in a lake unsupervised and he couldn't swim, you better believe I'm going to be upset. Now, granted, in my rationality, I'm probably going to either sue the counselor or the camp or both and own all of it and make everyday living hell for them legally and by the law. But I'm going to also talk smack to them. I'm going to say very mean things about them. I'm probably not going to go the route that Pamela Voorhees did. That would be Jason's mother, where she thought that the only way to seek revenge is by punishing these teenagers for not looking after her son. By punishment, we all know how Friday the 13th works. And by the way, for those people who don't know, Pamela Voorhees was the original killer in Friday the 13th. Sorry, Drew Barrymore. Now you know the answer there. But in retrospect, since Jason died when he was 10 years old, apparently, that would mean that Jason Voorhees would have both the brain, the mindset, and the body of a 10-year-old, right? Because when the body dies, it will decompose, but it will not grow any longer. It will not continue to get older. It's at whatever size it was when the thing died, when the person died. And if Jason died when he was 10 years old, then Jason Voorhees is in fact 10 years old. The mindset would also be 10 years old because he was 10 years old when he died. And anyone can say any kind of things there. So we have to ignore that factor, that Jason Voorhees all of a sudden he goes from being 10 years old to being this gigantuan human being who's bigger than most of these camp counselors. And all of these nasty horror icons and villains, they're so nasty that they still have morals. Jason Voorhees, for example, he won't kill kids. Freddy Krueger, Jason, is another one of those people from the Nightmare on Elm Street series. These are icons of horror. And if you were to ask someone, who are the faces, my wife calls them the Holy Trinity of horror. A lot of people would say Freddy, Jason, and Michael Myers would be the Trinity. But you might also have to, but then it doesn't stop there. Then you'd have to add Leatherface, Pinhead, Ghostface, and it can go on and on. But what makes a horror icon is who portrays them and who sells them the best and who does the best job connecting to the audience. Who scares the audience better? I mean, Jason Voorhees is a nasty, quiet, silent brute of a human being, of a thing. Michael Myers is a silent and deadly type himself. And he apparently is just a human as well. Freddy Krueger, on the other hand, he's a king of nightmares. He gets you while you're asleep. Now, what I want to take you back is to something that I said at the beginning of this statement, that I might see the good in people no matter who it is, and how I always knew I was different than others. As you guys know, I have been writing since I was very young, as I've talked about before. And one of the things I wanted to explore, because I often could believe it or not, I actually had empathy for both Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger. And you might say, oh, how can you like these horror villains in these movies? There's nothing likable. On the other hand, my reasoning was, but what if you were to save Jason from drowning? What if someone was there and did what they were supposed to do and plucked him out of the lake they were supposed to? And when Freddy was growing up, what if there was someone who recognized he was abused and all these other things? What if someone was nice enough to, help Freddy and be his friend? Just a friend to listen to him and try to make him feel better. Friendships and relationships have a lot more power than a lot of people might think. And I'm using those two examples because I explored that when I was younger. As I believe, if you were to save Jason from drowning, and if you were to befriend Freddy when he was growing up, I don't think either one would have turned out to be as bad as they were when they were adults. Because there's no reason for it. If the counselors saved Jason from drowning, there is no Friday the 13th series. Because Jason, his mother wouldn't have any reason to do what she did, and he would have no reason to avenge his mother, because a counselor cared enough to save her son and his life. And Robert Englund, Freddy Krueger, how he came into the world is very tragic and sad. In all honesty, talks a lot about, the unfortunate events that happens in violence. And what if someone was to befriend someone like him when he was growing up? Then he wouldn't turn out to be as bad as he was when he got older. So, in the Friendar series that I wrote, which was a very popular series, I started writing it when I was 11, I took those concepts of, Freddy and Jason. What if we were to make them good guys? Instead of these villains that they're made to be, So let me explain how I did that. So what I did was, in one of the stories in the Friendar series, it was called Friendar Halloween. No friend left behind, I think was the subtitle. So the Friendar stories would always start as the Friendar, and then there would be a subtitle. So Friendar, then it was a Halloween spectacular or something like that, and then whatever. Basically, the idea of the story was the leader of the story series, which was the character version of Jazz Vengeance. It was the leader of this group that didn't have a name yet. Jazz Vengeance was not me, Jazz Vengeance. This is the character in the storyline who's actually older than the character who I am. So, Jazz Vengeance, one of the things that people didn't understand, one of the things that he didn't understand, he refused to acknowledge the fact that he was special or he had abilities. What he would say is that he has Friendar. And Friendar gives him abilities that cannot be explained. He's empowered by the power of the F4L everywhere. That's what we would find out later on. But early in the series, the Friendar series, those powers, if you would, he said, listen, anybody can do this. It's just a matter of believing and blah, blah, blah. But one of the things that happened to Jazz Vengeance was he ended up dying in one of the stories. While he was dead, I know as ridiculous as it sounds. Remember, I was 11 when I wrote it. But one of the things that Jazz did while he was dead was he went and saved Jason from drowning. And he stood up for Freddy when people were bullying and making fun of him at school. So what ended up happening was, as they grew older, he basically retconned the characters. But because even at that age I knew that you couldn't actually call them by their names without getting in trouble, I just shortened their name to Fred and Jay of the Horror Connection. And what ended up happening was I took those characters, and as I said, the character, Jazz Vengeance, saved Jason from drowning and befriended Freddy when he was getting bullied and stood up for him at school. So neither one of them grew up to be these villainous monsters that people made them to be. Because there's no reason to. But what they did do is, because someone cared enough to save their lives or to be their friend when nobody else would, they grew a loyalty. Now, what's interesting is I kept the idea of what they're known for, the sleeping element and the water element. So, for example, the Friendar group, the Gavel Justice Group, that's the name of the justice group that they had formed. It would be Jazz, Fred, and Jay. And what would happen is an officer of the F4L is officer, judge, jury, and executioner of any legal power, more legal power than anybody, blah, blah, blah. Again, I was 11 when I wrote it, or started writing it. But when they were in pursuit of some nasty customer, some villainized person, if they touched water, Jason could spot where they were, could sense where they were. If they slept, Fred could find out where they were. And they could just go there and find whoever they were looking for when they were manhunting or whatever. And that's how I used their abilities in a good way. So Jason, whenever someone would touch water, if they were looking for somebody, he could sense where they were. And Fred in our story, and Jay for the opposite. But when Fred would, when we wanted to find someone else, when they fell asleep, Fred could find out where they were. So that's how I made these supposed horror villains into good guys. Which is interesting because the real life people who portray both characters are regular sweethearts. Robert Englund is probably bar none one of the best celebrities you could ever meet, because he takes the time to talk to you, to get to know you, and Robert Englund will talk to you as long as Robert Englund wants to. He's also saved my life, literally, by telling me I had an allergic reaction to a medication I had no idea I had. That's a real story. And Kane Hodder and C.J. Graham, Ken Kissinger, Derek Mears. There are so many people who have donned the mask, Steve Dash of Warren Gillette, people who have held the title and the mantle of Jason over the years, and I've never had or met better people than any of them who portrayed these characters, these giants. Tyler Mane, James Jude Courtney, Nick Castle, three people who particularly I've met plenty of times, who are the nicest, gentle giants you'll ever meet, who are also known for all playing Michael Myers in the Halloween series. Various, times and whatever. But it's amazing how the real-life people that portray these real-life villains are absolutely amazing people. And often never get the credit they deserve, other than at these horror conventions where they're given the respect by the horror community who embraces them. And, so there's that. But when you talk about the cliches of horror movies, and you talk about the things that just make no sense, you want to yell at the screen. The things that have common sense. Like, for example, how many times have you watched a movie and someone is in their room late at night? It's always at night. It's never during the day. It's at night, late at night. Everyone else is asleep, and you hear a bang downstairs. And now, what do you see in these movies? Usually, someone hides what? Either under the bed, or they pull the sheets over their head, and under the sheets they go. Anyone who has kids, I'm sure that you can relate to this. And also, we were kids once ourselves. We know that this doesn't work in reality. The big bump in the middle of your bed that is underneath the blanket that shapes like a human, that would be a giveaway that there's a human or a person underneath the blanket. It's not rocket science. And if you're going to a room and you expect someone to be in the room and then all of a sudden they're not, you would look under the bed, probably first, before you look anywhere else. Because any parent would know that. So I'm curious, how these people always miss these things. And also, how the parents in all of these movies also are the biggest idiots of the entire movie. Oftentimes, the parents give horrendous advice, or they are in pure denial of a situation, until the very last moment when all of a sudden they have to band together to fight the evil that is. I'm trying to think of an example of these, but there's plenty of examples out there of these types of films that sensationalize the fact that parents can be idiots, give the worst advice, and that your kids are whatever. I don't know how to explain the rationality of that scenario. But the idea, as a parent myself, I would be very much more attentive than these parents are. If my kids started telling me that they're talking to or they're being visited by something, the last thing I'm going to do is question their sanity and dismiss them. Because, especially if there's more than one kid in my household, and they're both telling me a similar story. But when you listen to when you see these movies, the parents are like, oh no, it's just this or it's just that, and they'll, deny anything in order to keep the movie going and alive. The babysitter who's home alone, or the young teenage girl or the young teenager at home alone. They hear a noise outside by the trash cans. Anybody who's in that scenario, you hear something at the trash cans, the last thing you're going to do is go outside to see what made the noise. But in the horror movies, you got to go and find out what knocked those trash cans over. And all that stuff. So, these are horror cliches that we in the horror community just kind of oversee, because if you look at them rationally, the horror movies lose their power and they become comical. I guess that's probably how and why horror movies really don't bother me, because a lot of them are the same things over and over again. the cliches, the dumb teenagers, the dumb parents. Never little kids. Little kids usually are the heroes of the series, or the protagonists in some cases. And I think it's interesting is that horror movies tend to have the same formula. Scream, I think, went ahead and explored some of these things, the certain, quote, rules of a horror movie, which, by the way, since that movie has been, all of those things have been proven not to be the case either. I think within their movie they've changed those rules. But, there's that. So, that's the horror cliches in horror films, modern horror. Let's move to our main event of the evening, will we? All right, everyone, we've come to this point in our story, and we're going to be winding it down here. But what I wanted to basically say is I want everyone to have a happy and healthy and safe Halloween. I wanted to also say publicly that in the past, I have often looked at October with dread and fear. Not fear, I hate October prior. In my lifetime, I've had some of the worst moments of my life take place in October. I've lost my girlfriend. I lost my first son within a week of each other. Well, first my son, then my girlfriend a week later. My best friend prior to that was shot to death in front of me and died in my arms on Halloween night. And a lot of other tragedies that would have happened in October. But prior to this year, I have often looked at October with dread and annoyance and anxiousness. I often, anytime anything would go wrong, I would say, well, that's just October. The beginning of this year, the beginning of this month, I decided I am not going to be a victim to this anymore. I'm not going to put myself in this category anymore. I'm going to tell you why, because also one of my greatest moments in my life took place in October, and that being, it was the month that I got married, and my wife and my kids and I became a real family. And that, to me, has saved my life in more ways than one. It has given me a new perspective on life, as kids tend to do anyway, and as family does. So, this is the first year, really, that I haven't let October get the best of me. Normally, what I would do in the past is get myself so busy that I wouldn't think of what month I'm in. I'm aware of what month it is. And yeah, some things have happened this month that aren't so great, but you know what? I have overcome this. My wife has been a fantastic support. My kids have been a support. My F4Ls have been supportive. Yeah, I've been busy, so I'm not really thinking much about it. But you know what? I can't change the past. What happened in the past is right there in the past. If I'm going to go forward in life, I just have to keep going forward and leave what's in the past right where it belongs. So this is the first year in a long time that I haven't let October haunt me, or haven't let it affect me in that sense. And I'm happy about that. And I'm proud of the fact that I am growing myself. Even myself, at my age, I'm still growing and learning, even at my age. I might have college degrees. I might have all kinds of sport accolades. But in the hindsight, in the end of the day, I continue to learn like everybody else. Everyone, this has been a long show. This has been our Halloween special. I want to thank everyone for making October special for everyone. I want to thank our new guests that we've had this month. I want to say that we have some awesome guests coming up still this month. And we look forward to bringing you guys the rest of 2023 on Icons of the F4L. Tomorrow, my son and I have Bowling Warfare. I also have some people that I'm looking forward to scheduling to come to the F4L Headquarters Podcast. This year has been a very interesting year in general. It started out different, and then I got sidetracked for a little while with a project, and as much as that bummed me out, I didn't let it get to me. I continued going. I have no hard feelings towards the people who were involved with that. I pity them, honestly. I feel bad for them that, they were not able to look at reason and facts, and that they didn't know me as well as everyone else does. So, and I also feel sad that I didn't get to celebrate my 3-year anniversary doing this show when I should have, and other things that I didn't get to do because I put all those things on the back burner. Next year, I return to pro wrestling, as in 2024. I will also continue doing this show and Icons of the F4L, also working and doing everything else I am. I am a prominent member of the Monster Mania team, so if you're ever going to the Monster Mania convention, with the exception of this one coming up, I haven't talked about that yet, but I'm going to make that announcement coming up this week regarding my the next show of Monster Mania. How I will not be in Oak, Pennsylvania, unfortunately, but for good reasons. We'll go into that. I am very excited this week as we have some very special guests, some old friends of mine coming on the show. Next month will mark my 22 years in pro wrestling, because that's when I started pro wrestling school in November of 1998. So I got to look at the math there, but that was when I first went into wrestling school, was in November of 1998. My son's birthday is next month, and all that other stuff, and my mother's would have been. So, folks, because today would have been my grandmother's birthday, happy birthday to my grandmother, who taught me a lot about wisdom and knowledge, and also is responsible for my martial art training. She was a natural fighter and storyteller. To everyone else out there, thank you for listening. May all your dreams come true. Peace from the F4L Headquarters Podcast. Have a safe and happy and healthy Halloween. Peace, everybody.